Lyman orchards started in 1741 when John and Hope Lyman bought a small farm in Middlefield. Today, 277 years later, the 8th and 9th generations of Hope's and John's descendants operate Lyman orchards on 1,100 acres that include the original land purchased in 1741. I'm not a member of the Lyman family, and I don't work for Lyman orchards, but for the last 30 years I've lived about a mile up the road from the Apple Barrel Market. And passing regularly by a sign that says, since 1741, was like catnip to a historian. What I discovered through my research was a compelling family saga begging to be told. The Lymans participated in major events and movements during the period embraced by the novel from 1741 to 1871. These included the American Revolution, the Temperance Crusade, the Abolition movement, the Underground Railroad, the Transportation and Industrial Revolutions, and more. At the same time, their everyday lives were in most ways typical of those of other New Englanders for their time. Thy Children's Children is historical fiction grounded in research into real people and events. Much of what's depicted actually happened. Parts that are mostly or entirely invented still accurately reflect the reality of the time period and the culture in which they're set. I'd like to share a couple examples of how I constructed a skeleton of fact from my research, some of it conducted here at the State Library, and then applied to it the flesh of imagination to create the novel. I drew on my research findings to help craft various individuals' character. One example is a Lyman widow who was considering remarrying. This would require that she leave Middlefield and move to another town. She hesitated to take this step because, according to an 1865 genealogy, she worried how her son would, quote, know to go to the mill if I go off. That is, how would he remember to do his chores if she wasn't there to remind him? The son at the time was a 33-year-old married father of 2. I also discovered in land records that this woman had purchased 25 acres in her own name, an extremely unusual step for a woman in the 1700s when everything a woman owned automatically was her husband's. So this, along with other information I discovered, gave me a sense of a woman with an independent, perhaps even domineering personality, and I wrote her character to reflect that. I discovered that John and Hope's son Elihu had served in the Continental Army during the American Revolution. In the standard source, The Record of Service of Connecticut Men in the War of the Revolution, there's an entry for Ensign Elihu Lyman, residence Middletown, Middlefield then being part of Middletown, in Colonel Huntington's regiment, the 17th Regiment of the Continental Army. It said he was wounded and taken prisoner at the Battle of Long Island on August 27, 1776. I unearthed additional details in a document in the Revolutionary War Archives here at the State Library. On May 20th, 1778, days after being released from captivity, Elihu Lyman petitioned the General Assembly for reimbursement of property he lost when he was captured by the enemy on Long Island. In his petition, Elihu Lyman stated that at the Battle of Long Island, he, quote, was unfortunately wounded and taken prisoner, was stripped naked by the enemy, who took from him 1 hat with silver trimmings, 1 gun, bayonet, cartridge box, and 1 silver watch, 5 silver dollars and 30 continental dollars. I was so excited to find that document, to have from the man's own lips almost a description of what had happened to him. So I wove these facts with information taken from accounts by other Connecticut soldiers taken prisoner at the Battle of Long Island to recreate Elihu Lyman's capture by the enemy for the novel. And I'd like to read part of that chapter. The Hessians surrounded the Americans, muskets trained on them menacingly at point-blank range. The soldier Elihu faced was a sinewy, hard-looking sergeant of about 40, with a thin, pointed, upturned mustache. His uncommon height was accentuated by his tall, cone-shaped headgear. The sergeant, without warning, grabbed the musket from Elihu's hands. He righted the musket and noticed the freshly dried blood coating its bayonet, evidence that Elihu had maimed or killed an enemy soldier that day. The Hessian eyes narrowed in naked hatred. The Hessian growled what was clearly a threat in his guttural German. Elihu held his tongue and saw that the Hessian seemed disciplined enough not to act without cause on his blatant loathing for Americans. The Hessian sergeant reached out to relieve Elihu of his cartridge box and canteen, then gestured at the haversack. Elihu shrugged it off and handed it to his captor. Rummaging through the haversack, the Hessian pulled out a handful of continental currency, which he tossed contemptuously on the ground. He reached in again, and a satisfied smile crossed his pockmarked face. He brought out $5 silver, which he jingled in his palm before pocketing them. Next, the Hessian snatched Elihu's silver-trimmed hat from his head. Then he gestured at Elihu's shoes, barking out what was clearly a command. Elihu stared at the soldier in indignant disbelief. He'd expected to lose his musket and ammunition, and hadn't been surprised when the greedy mercenary confiscated his haversack, canteen money, and even his fine hat. But something as essential as shoes was another matter. "I protest this theft, Elihu said firmly. His defiance seemed to please the Hessian. Smiling wickedly, the sergeant pressed the tip of his bayonet against Elihu's breastbone and repeated his order. Afraid the Hessian was trying to goad him into resistance that would provide an excuse to kill him, Elihu made no further protest. Pushing the bayonet carefully aside with his finger, he leaned over, unbuckled the mud-caked shoes with sharp, angry jerks, pulled them off, and handed them to the grinning sergeant, who passed them to a fellow mercenary. But the Hessian wasn't finished. Clearly relishing the situation, he flicked back the black lapels of Elihu's uniform coat with his bayonet and barked another order in German. Seething at his impotence, Elihu ripped off his coat, unbuttoned his waistcoat with fingers trembling with barely contained anger, and handed them to his captor. Feeling a hard shape inside the waistcoat, the Hessian searched until he found Elihu's silver watch in the pocket. Delighted with his unexpected treasure, the Hessian tucked the timepiece into his own waistcoat pocket before giving the garments to a subordinate. The Hessian turned back and stared at Elihu expectantly. After a long moment during which Elihu felt he might explode with rage, he untied the linen strip from around his wounded arm. He pulled his shirt over his head, gritting his teeth against the fresh pain of the bullet wounds being torn open when cloth stuck to them by dried blood was pulled away. Elihu put his shirt into the mercenary's outstretched hand, but the Hessian kept his arm extended. Elihu leaned over to pull off his muddy stockings, which he placed atop the shirt. Now wearing only his breeches, Elihu shivered as a cool breeze raised goose flesh on his bare arms and chest. Still, the Hessian stood with his arm outstretched. When Elihu made no further move, the Hessian snarled a command and snapped his fingers. Elihu desperately searched the mercenary's hard blue eyes for any trace of humanity, and found none. Realizing his life still hung in the balance, Elihu, blushing with humiliation, unbuttoned his breeches, pulled them off, and laid them atop his stockings. He stood naked as the day he was born, blood trickling down his arm. The Hessian laughed in sadistic triumph. He turned to hand the garments to another subordinate, then whirled back and without warning raised his musket and dealt Elihu a vicious blow to the left temple with the butt of the weapon. Blinding pain exploded inside Elihu's skull. He staggered, then fell to his knees. The Hessian struck again, ramming the butt of his musket against Elihu's lower back, causing him to sprawl prone on the ground as he cried out in anguish. The Hessian continued to beat Elihu with the musket butt, cursing furiously in German. He struck his defensive captive on the naked legs, shoulders, back, and head. Despite the disorienting blow to his temple, Elihu had sufficient presence of mind to curl his body into a tight ball, head tucked inward and hands clasped over it to protect his genitals and face. Just when Elihu was sure the Hessian intended to beat him to death, the man broke off his assault. He delivered a last vicious kick to Elihu's ribs, then yanked him to his feet by his wounded arm. The final example I'll offer of how I combined documented history with imagination involves the Lyman family's role in the abolition movement and the Underground Railroad. In the century and a half since the end of the Civil War, the North has come to be perceived in the public mind as a stronghold of opposition to slavery and of assistance to slaves seeking freedom on the clandestine, illegal Underground Railroad. But the truth was far different. For much of the time leading up to the Civil War, most Northerners considered abolitionists to be dangerous radicals who threatened to tear the nation apart in their crusade against slavery. Many Northerners believed they had no right to interfere with slavery in the Southern states. Individuals who spoke out in favor of freeing slaves risked alienating their friends and neighbors and were sometimes physically attacked. They were subject to heavy fines and imprisonment. In 1850, Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Act, one of the most notorious pieces of legislation in the nation's history. This law strengthened federal penalties for helping runaway slaves. It made it much easier for individuals pursuing fugitives to capture and return them to the South. And it required every person, when called upon, to assist in running down and seizing a fugitive under penalty of law. By this time, the Lymans had been outspoken advocates of abolishing slavery for more than a decade and had become involved with the Underground Railroad. I needed a way to make clear to readers the hostility and danger they faced for adhering to these principles. I found it in a pamphlet in the State Library's collections that would publish the proceedings of a union meeting attended by 2,000 citizens in New Haven, just 20 miles from Middlefield, a month after the Fugitive Slave Act became law. The message of this gathering, at which leading citizens of the city and state spoke, was enthusiastic and absolute support for enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Act and loathing for anyone who objected to it. I used some artistic license and wrote a scene putting William Lyman, his son David, and his son-in-law, the Reverend James Dickinson, all abolitionists, at this meeting, in the lion's den, so to speak. And I'll read you some from that chapter. Many New Haven merchants and manufacturers and the clerks and mechanics they employed had common cause in placating the South, which was a prime market for the city's products. Just one of many affected industries was the production of carriages, which more than 4 dozen New Haven firms manufactured for sale, mostly to Southern customers. Anything that threatened to upset Southern consumers endangered these men's livelihoods. The next of the meeting's speakers ascended the platform, a slender, distinguished figure in his 60s. Dr. Nathaniel Taylor was a renowned minister who for more than a century had been professor of didactic theology in Yale's Divinity School. James Dickinson had studied under him. Why should not the slaves at the South submit to the condition which Providence has assigned them? Dr. Taylor posed the clearly rhetorical question in the voice of authority perfected during decades in the pulpit and classroom. Their condition is 1,000-fold better than it would have been in the pagan midnight and savagism of their native land, he reasoned calmly. Why should they not be grateful for its blessings and submissive to its evils, till by some practical change it can be made better instead of immeasurably worse? A general buzz of agreement rose up from the crowd. To hear Dr. Taylor, endowed with the authority of both a minister of God and a Yale faculty member, declare Negroes should be thankful for being held in dehumanizing bondage, disgusted James Dickinson. He instinctively started to raise his hand to attract Dr. Taylor's attention, to make a rebuttal, but a vice-like grip on his wrist stopped him. He struggled against it for a moment until he realized the hand holding him back belonged to his father-in-law. William Lyman's resolute gaze and barely perceptible shake of his head conveyed to James the absolute necessity for restraint. David Lyman was studying him with alarm, James saw. David pointedly surveyed the men around them. James followed his gaze and saw that half a dozen men who clearly recognized the trio from Middlefield were watching him intently, like keen-eyed hawks, waiting for a rabbit to break cover and expose itself to attack. James slowly lowered his arm. "I have another question to ask," continued Dr. Taylor, who hadn't noticed James' interrupted gesture. "What right to protection do fugitive slaves acquire at the North?" he demanded indignantly. "What right have they to come here and claim our protection, when by affording it we violate a lawful compact and endanger the existence of such a nation as this? Am I bound to receive into my family and to protect and support every man or woman whose condition would thereby be improved, be the consequences to the well-being of my family what they may be?" The crowd rumbled in even stronger approval of the minister's words. This time it was William Lyman who reacted. His nostrils flared and his eyes blazed with contempt. Dr. Taylor was callously equating a fugitive slave seeking sanctuary in mortal fear for his life with an ill-mannered beggar asking for an inconvenient favor. Still, William held his tongue. As a prominent, some would say notorious, abolitionist, many suspected he participated in the Underground Railroad. Yet he'd never spoken specifically in support of aiding fugitive slaves. To do so, he feared, might compromise his ability to help runaways. I hope these samples have given you an idea of how I crafted Thy Children's Children to be a novel that both entertains and informs. And I hope readers will enjoy the book and also be inspired to learn more about the facts behind the fiction, because that's how I believe historical fiction can truly serve as a portal to the past. With that, I thank you for being a good audience, and if I can answer any questions, I'll be happy to. Yes, I know that there was a letter, a post-Civil War letter, in which William Lyman's widow writes to her sister-in-law and talks about how he was attacked by a mob in Durham for his abolitionist sympathies. And William Lyman was one of the founders of the Connecticut Anti-Slavery Society in 1838. And then, after the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act, William and David and James Dickinson and 3 other men in Middlefield published in 2 Middletown newspapers their manifesto against the Fugitive Slave Act. And in it, they ended up by saying, "This law we will not obey." I said, that's like putting a neon sign that says Underground Railroad stop over your house. So they were very open about, or I shouldn't say open, but they were clearly publicly involved with this.
Did fugitive slaves stay at the time?
I believe so. Well, if you can go by, all right, if you go by that certainly sounds like we're participating in the Underground Railroad. I did find a wonderful document at the Middlesex County Historical Society. And it was a letter addressed to William Lyman. But when you open it up, it's actually addressed to a couple, I think it was Kate and Sam Burton. And as you read it, it becomes clear, it's written from Delaware. It's addressed, they're runaway slaves. Okay, this is before the Fugitive Slave Act. But it's clear there's a fellow in Delaware who is writing to them saying that their owner has died. And if they want their children, they need to send somebody down to buy them. But he says, don't you come back, because they're tight as a tick on me, and they'll, so he's basically telling these people, they're obviously runaways because they can't go back. Their children are slaves, and William Lyman is the conduit. He is the connection for these people. So I thought that was pretty strong evidence that they, in fact, are helping fugitive slaves. Yes?
I apologize because I got in late.
That's okay.
But did you address the family's reactions to your book?
I didn't. No, they like it. They're okay with it. They like it. It's funny because I started this back in the 90s. Okay, this is how long I've been working on this. Back in the 1990s, a few family members commissioned me to just write a straight history of the family for them personally. So I did that. And as I'm doing it, as I said, I'm going, oh, this is like an incredible family saga. So I told them, I said, I'm going to write a novel based on this, and got their okay to use materials that they had. And after that, I really wasn't in touch with anybody for a long time. I would like run in the grocery store, run into one of them, and she'd say, how's the novel going? I'd be like, it's coming along. So when I finally got it done, so basically they didn't know about it. They didn't know about it. They didn't have, because I didn't want it to be the authorized Lyman novel, and they didn't either. So when I finally got it done almost 2 years ago, I called them up and said, hi, the novel's done. And they're like, the novel, okay. So I gave them copies, and they've read it, they liked it, they sell it in the Apple Barrel, so yeah, I think they've been pretty pleased with it. Any other questions? Yes?
So it's the facts about the Lyman family turning your swerve into historical fiction. Continue with that, or will you kind of keep up with the historical fiction industry?
I like historical fiction a lot, just because I really do think it's, it really does get people into it, and you can do things with historical fiction that you can't. I mean, if you're doing the Addams Family, okay, you've got a massive amount of material for about every moment of their lives. But for most people, if you're trying to do that, you can't. You have to make it up. But what I really wanted to do with this was, I wanted people to read it and know that they were getting as close as I could get to what really happened, okay? Which was good in a way, because you've got your plot all laid out for you. But it's also bad because you can't do things. I couldn't send them off to Europe because they didn't go to Europe. So it's sort of, it's sort of limiting, but also it helps you. And I would like to try and write another novel. This one's sort of long. But people say once they get into it, it's not intimidating, though it might look it. But yeah, I would like to write another novel. John Trumbull, the artist. I've wanted to write a novel about John Trumbull, the artist, for literally 35 years, okay? He's so fascinating because he paints, we all see the revolution through his eyes, as they've said. You cannot pick up a book on the American Revolution without seeing a Trumbull painting on the cover, on the jacket. And he has such a wonderful story because he comes from an environment that could not have been more hostile to an artist. His father's the governor of Connecticut. Nobody is an artist in Connecticut. Nobody's an artist in America as professionally. And he has this talent, and he's just possessed by it. He also, from like the age of 4, is blind in one eye. Okay? This is not, even today, would you say to your kid? But he just has this need to do art, to paint, to create. And eventually, he sort of melds that with this, commemorating and memorializing the Great Revolution. So he sort of combines the two things. But he's got a great, lots of, he goes off to England and he's taken prisoner in retaliation for John Andre, because he goes to England and it's during the Revolution. He's the son of the governor of Connecticut. They don't bother him, and then finally they throw him into prison for a while, and it's just a wonderful story. And he deserves it. So 35 years, give me a few more. Yes?
One of the things that I'm sure that happens is you encounter a number of members of your family, and you choose to write about some. Were there any scoundrels who left out?
No, not really. I invented a couple just because you need that. I took certain personalities and said, okay. But no, not really. I didn't find anybody who no, I guess not. I would have put them in if I had. It would have been, sort of difficult. But again, as I said, this wasn't the authorized Lyman family novel. This was the story that I found.
Why'd you stop at 1870?
There's a reason, without giving you a spoiler, there's sort of an event that happens. Okay, but the other is, that's 130 years and 630 pages, okay? And after, the family's still fascinating after that. They get into the Lyman Gun Site Corporation. They're still into farming. They do a lot of really interesting things, but it's not as interesting to me. The period wasn't as interesting to me as up to the post-Civil War. So, anything else? Great. Well, thank you very much for coming out. It's a good audience.